Hello, everyone. All right, so I am holding something in my fingers. I will be blown away impressed if you can guess what that is. It's a mushy mess. In fact, I should probably put it down because it's mushy. It is actually chocolate-covered cashew. Any idea why I have a piece of, I didn't find it in my pocket randomly. Why would I have chocolate-covered cashew with me? Yes, and delicious. Right? I'm not getting any money from them, but that cashew, the cashew actually grows at the bottom, on the outside of a thing called an apple. Often in, let's say, Ivory Coast. Right? There, it's plucked by farmers, smallholder farmers. Then it's shipped to a processing facility where it's roasted, peeled, then sent somewhere else where it's packaged, maybe it's salted, maybe it's put into a kind bar or something of that sort, and sold for a lot of money. How much of that, for every dollar, how much money do you think the smallholder farmer makes versus the brand? That is the problem with the value chain, is that the people working the hardest are actually making the least amount of money. Let's take a very different scenario, which is when COVID hit, the world was struggling to figure out solutions. One of the conversations that was going on in the context, for example, of the African continent was how do we get concentrators, oxygen concentrators there? The world mobilized, bunch of concentrators were shipped there, then in India during the Delta wave. And a lot of these concentrators kind of sat there. Over time, many of them will break. There won't be parts. That is an issue of the supply chain, different from the value chain, which is quite often in an aid and donor-driven world, stuff is shipped with zero thought towards how does stuff get maintained. Now, most of the stuff is actually not that hard to maintain. It takes work. It takes the building of an industry. All of that takes time. But when we just ship stuff funded by donors, part of what we're not doing is actually investing in the local supply chain, local capacity, so that over time all of this stuff can get built. Let's look at a third issue, which is in Indonesia, for example. Indonesia is a supplier of a lot of palm oil. Where does all that come from? It comes from land that has been deforested. And the palm oil, again, gets shipped to wealthy countries. So in other words, in this complex ecosystem where there's so much demand and consumption of these high-value things in wealthier countries, there's a lot of stuff that's sent to lower-income countries. There is almost no thought put into local supply chains, local value chains, and an equitable distribution of the money that gets spent. So this panel, they are dealing with this stuff every day. They're doing amazing work. And with that, I will hand it off to Atti Worku, who is with the Africa Visionary Fund, committed to this and doing lots of amazing work herself on this. Over to you.
Thank you, Shashi. It's my pleasure. Make sure the mic's on. It's my pleasure to be here and moderating this really rich discussion with an incredible group of panelists. My name is Atti Worku. I'm the co-CEO of the African Visionary Fund. We're a grant maker that provides unrestricted multi-year grants to African-founded, African-led organizations that are working in their communities in sub-Saharan Africa. Globally, companies and communities have felt the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic and other recent economic crises. Supply chains have been disrupted and livelihoods have been deeply affected, especially in countries with a direct legacy of colonization that has caused dependence on foreign aid and import commodities. Historically, as we all know, globalization has been exploitative, and recently we've seen the signs that it can be risky, unsustainable, and vulnerable to global economic shocks. So it's clear that we need to reimagine who holds power, who creates value, where value is created, and who benefits from the value creation in the global economic system. I think it's important to do so through a decolonization lens. So today, I'm really honored to be joined by this group of leaders who are spearheading the emergence of shared value creation that promotes local ownership and community agency over their economic destiny. Let's start with some introductions. Ndidi, founder and executive chair of African Food Changemakers. Amanda, co-creator of Good Market. Marcio, director of the Territorial Governance Facility, Forest Trends Communities and Territorial Governance Initiative. And last but not least, Shreenal, the chief executive officer of Oxygen Hub, initiative of Institute for Transformative Technologies. I'm really looking forward to hearing about the context in which all of you work. I'm sure the audience is also very excited about that as well. And the solutions that can be taken away by the audience doing the work of shifting narratives, advancing justice, and increasing resilience. So let's jump right in. This question will be to all of you. I'm really curious to know how you can help us add some personal context to the issue of globalization. So let's think through, what does it mean for innovators and entrepreneurs to be disconnected from the people or places in their target markets? And how does that manifest where you are? Ndidi, if we would start with you.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor and privilege to be here, and thanks Atti and to Skoll for this opportunity. So I wear a number of hats in the food ecosystem, and I've been in this sector as a social entrepreneur working for about 25 years. So I'm going to use three lenses from my experience. The first lens is really from the narrative. When you think of Africa, you think of a hungry child. This is a narrative that I came face to face with when I moved to the US as a college student. And people would say, oh, you're from Nigeria. Oh, my mom used to say, finish your dinner, they're hungry children in Biafra. And so this narrative affects our work as social innovators, because oftentimes people don't see us as agents of change in our own community. Come and help the starving people in Africa. So I came face to face with this when I started working in the food ecosystem, because while on the continent we're naturally endowed for agricultural excellence, we actually feed ourselves. 80% of the food eaten in Africa, over 80%, is grown by Africans. So the mindset that we have to bring in food into Africa to feed Africans almost distorts the ecosystem. Now, the challenge when you think about the food ecosystem is that those on the ground who are the farmers are growing food for their families and for communities. But most of these ecosystems have been set up to export primary products. You talked about cashew, we talk about cocoa, we talk about sesame, and the list is endless. However, the local food ecosystem needs to be strengthened by Africans themselves. So what I've been working on through ACE Foods, which is an agro-processing company, we set up Sahel Consulting and Africa Food Changemakers, is to empower local communities to improve their productivity, process locally, and displace imports. And we are seeing tremendous impacts, because the job creation, the wealth creation is exponential. Now, for us, others who want to come into this context, and even now we've seen COVID, we've seen the Russia-Ukraine war and the impact it's had on fertilizer and seeds. The first thing I hear in international engagement is, oh, we need to give seeds and fertilizer to Africans because they can't get fertilizer from Ukraine. And I'm like, oh, but we actually have a local fertilizer industry, and we've been working to build it for the last 20 years. So if you're going to come in and give us seeds, you're distorting this ecosystem. So that mindset shift has to change, realizing that the agents on the ground who are working and need support and engagement, but at their own terms on the ground. Because if you bring in food aid or gifts, it distorts the ecosystem. And that's the first message, and that's been very real to me. The second is the importance of value addition. We often talk in value chains about locally sourced and supporting farmers, but oftentimes we're not investing in the processing and the packaging of proudly African food for local economies and for exports. And I've been very excited about some of the entrepreneurs I work with Africa Food Changemakers in 37 African countries who are creating world-class products that deserve to be on global stages. But when entrepreneurs and social innovators and funders meet them, they say, oh, we want you to work on primary production. We don't want to work on processing. The value addition creates more jobs, creates higher paying jobs, and helps people move up the ladder out of poverty. And that shift has to occur, because if you see proudly African products on global shelves, it also changes the mindset. We've been very inspired by what Japan has done with sushi. And our excitement is we want jollof rice to displace sushi, right? We want teff to displace white flour, and we want fonio to displace quinoa. Or we can coexist together. But when you start enjoying these products on your kitchen shelves every day, on your kitchen table, it starts shifting your mindset, realizing that it's an African farmer who grew this, an African female entrepreneur who processed it and packaged it, and it came onto your tables and it was world class. And that has to happen. Value addition has to happen for job creation and income diversification. And the last thing is really around partnerships. The value of partnerships in the global food landscape means that we're all dependent on each other in this global food ecosystem. And from farm to fork, everyone has an important role to play. And so shifting the narrative from saying agriculture, food, and nutrition to saying a food ecosystem where chefs who are co-creating and innovating all the way down is critical. And that we don't work in silos, because the gender movement, the climate movement is all critical for the food ecosystem movement. And so through every platform I have, I'm saying, no, we're not talking about agriculture anymore. We're talking about food. And we're talking about food systems, so financing, climate, gender. And together we can basically deconstruct the barriers we've created and ensure that as Africans, we feed ourselves and feed the world. And that's what I've been working on, and that's what excites me every day.
Thank you so much, Ndidi. It was really wonderful. I really love the idea of narratives that affect how social innovators are viewed, and how changing those narratives is really important to thinking through how we're all viewed by this lens. Amanda, back to you. To just repeat the question again, what does it mean for innovators and entrepreneurs to be disconnected from the people or places in their target markets, and how does that manifest where you are?
Yeah. Thanks, Atti. I am so happy to be here with all of you. So I want to talk about local resilient economic systems, but to do that and to talk about good market, I need to step back a bit and talk at a system level, at kind of a global level, to be able to explain what it is that we do. And this is not going to be news to anyone in this room, but we have a current economic story that isn't working for us, right? It's based on the goal being to maximize profits or to continuously grow. And that right there is at the root of the problems that I think almost everybody at this event is working on. It's at the root of many of the problems with inequality, structural racism, whether we're talking the climate crisis, biodiversity, what we heard yesterday about the algorithms in social media that are distorting our democracies. This is at a root cause at a lot of those problems. And when it comes to trade and value chains, what we're talking about today, the way that manifests is if you're going to maximize profits, you remove redundancies. It's about just in time, it's about huge concentration. And what we've seen over time is that means wealth being pulled out of communities. It means our living ecosystems being treated as if they're natural resources to take from or to put waste into. And it means that we're seeing really diverse societies, like the groups that Ndidi works with, and really diverse ecosystems being turned into monocultures. And that is a real risk, as we saw during COVID, right? Because when we have a system that has no redundancy, when we have a system that is really brittle and fragile and doesn't have diversity, it means we can't respond and adapt to change. We can't adapt to crises. We can't respond to some of the challenges that we're facing right now. So that's the difficult news. The good news is that the new economic system is already emerging, right? We all know this. We're seeing this. Around the world, there are millions of enterprises and individuals that are choosing a different story. They're choosing a different narrative, right? They're choosing to put people and planet first over profit maximization. And we're seeing this all parts of the world. And so the work that I've been doing recently, spent the last 20 years in Sri Lanka, the work I'm doing now is with Good Market, and it's a digital commons, so like a Wikipedia, and it's to make it easier for all of us who are putting people and planet first to find each other, to connect with each other, to be able to trade with each other. And what's been amazing, so it started in Sri Lanka, there's now groups across 95 countries. What's been amazing is it gives kind of a bird's eye view of what's emerging in this space. How are people responding to these kinds of challenges? So there are, including Ndidi's network, African Food Changemakers, and many of their enterprises. There's groups that identify as social enterprises, responsible businesses, nonprofits, mutual aid, producer groups, all different kinds of organizations that are using the site. And what we're seeing as a pattern beyond the obvious things of, so they're focusing in on doing things for their local economy. They know their local community very well. So beyond the obvious thing about what that means for climate change and trade and having short supply chains, they tend to be much more likely to hire, instead of maximizing profits and then contributing in excess through CSR philanthropy, they're baking that into their design. They are distributive and regenerative by design. So they're hiring diverse groups. They're using suppliers in their local community, suppliers that have the same kind of values. And that has just been incredible to see this pattern coming up in all different parts of the world. And just the last bit that I think has been really fun to see is what that's doing for local supply chains. If you're doing this kind of work, you choose to work with others with shared values. So we're seeing new supply chains emerge. And we're seeing just this kind of reclaiming of diversity and local pride. So exactly the example that was given here, like we're seeing groups that are taking food that's indigenous to an area, like teff or like different millets, or even in the desert Southwest in the US, we're seeing old heirloom grains coming up. And we're seeing young entrepreneurs coming up with new recipes and value-added foods. We're seeing groups in India where we've got young designers that are taking Halla cotton, which is very, it's rain-fed cotton, dyeing it with madder root, doing really great handloom and then great designs, coming up with new ideas. So that's a pattern we're seeing. And we're seeing corporations starting to reshore many of the things they were doing in the past. And that's opening opportunities for local enterprises that are distributive. So we're seeing cut and sew operations, manufacturing reemerge in the US in marginalized communities. So I know we were supposed to be talking about the problem and the disconnected, but I had to immediately jump us into some of these positive things that we're seeing emerging.
Thank you, Amanda. Yeah. That was really great. I took really an interesting point there around how do we put people and planet first instead of maximizing profits and removing redundancies. So thank you for that really great point. Marcio, coming to you, again, the same thing around what does it mean for innovators and entrepreneurs to be disconnected from the people and the places their target markets are, and how is that manifesting in your work?
Okay, thank you, Atti. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here, sharing this space with my friends here. The first thing I would like to share was about my experience moving to the Amazon region 20 years ago. When I moved to live there, I moved to a region at the exact moment when Cargill had just built a harbor to export soybean to the world. And at that moment, deforestation increased 5 times, 500% in that region due to the lack of territorial definition about protected areas, about indigenous lands. So by the end of the day, only these protected areas governed by indigenous people, local communities, really resisted from the very strong power of this deforestation machine to plant soybean in that region. And with that harbor, a huge strategy of infrastructure started to be built there, showing the power of these global forces, and the commodity value chains to change the reality of that region, making people and communities move to the surrounds of the big cities in that region. And that was my first living experience in the Amazon. But it's important to understand the different contexts, the diversity of contexts when you talk about Amazon. And I would like to move and focus in the territory where Forest Trends is working for the last 80 years with indigenous territories in a region where a road built 30, 40 years ago, during the military dictatorship in Brazil, promote that same change I saw 20 years ago in that other region, as I was telling you. In that region, so if you see a satellite image of that region, you see islands of forests which are exactly these indigenous territories. Outside the indigenous territories, you have no forests anymore. You have only pasture, and the meat value chain, cattle ranching is the main force there, promoting this deforestation, and indigenous communities had to move to the limits of their territories, exactly as a strategy for controlling and protecting their territories. And because of that position, so living in the frontier between the forest and the farms, they struggled a lot and fight a lot to keep their way of living, but got closer and closer to this market reality, to this monetary economy. And for us, when we talk about territorial governance, we are always trying to work and to support these indigenous communities, groups, and organizations to reach the balance between the cultural, economic, and political aspects of this territorial governance. And this situation of being so close to the market and depending on money and on this monetary economy is a very, so there are many nuances of strengths and weaknesses there related to the necessity of money for living and the conditions of food security and food sovereignty they can keep or not because of this idea of being closer to the market. So we are living there with these production systems around the indigenous lands and threatening these indigenous territories in different ways. While the indigenous communities are trying to create new strategies and new approaches to produce what they want, but keeping their food security based on their vision, on their cosmovision, their culture. And this is something I want to share more about some strategies related to promoting regenerative agriculture, agroforestry systems, to bring about the changes in these production systems, ensuring they can keep their food security accordingly to their own culture. At the same time, they can reach out to the market in trying to find this balance between the cultural and the economic aspects of territorial governance.
Thank you so much, Marcio. It's really fascinating to hear a little bit more about, maybe in a room where people think a lot around market-driven solutions are the way to go, to really take a step back from that and think about what are the consequences that come out of a market-driven solution that may not necessarily be thinking about the environment, communities, and how we're impacting our world in, like Amanda said earlier, in the interest of profits and monoculture and all of those things. Thank you. Shreenal, to you, again, around what does it mean for you, for innovators and entrepreneurs to be disconnected from the people or places in their target markets, and how is that working out in where you are, specifically like being placed in Kenya, but also in the work that you're doing with Oxygen Hub?
Sure. Thanks, Atti, and great to hear everyone's perspective on the different ranges of challenges and how you're solving for it. And thank you for having me. I think, if we go back 2.5 years, COVID, I'm pretty sure, most of us here, or guys that have been based on the continent experienced a close friend, a family member, or someone that passed from COVID. I had that experience in my family, and that was because there was a lack of access to oxygen at the time where I was based in Mombasa in Kenya. And honestly, the fundamental there was, it wasn't just because of a supply chain constraint. It was because there was a gap in the supply, period. And that issue has been present even before COVID. COVID simply highlighted that. Prior to COVID, you have challenges still around access to oxygen to just even simply treat, respiratory or high disease burdens such as pneumonia, neonatal respiratory conditions. I mean, it's estimated you have about 2,000 or so deaths, was a stat I read, that young children die from pneumonia. That's over 730,000 or so kids per year. I mean, this is preventable, and this issue is one that doesn't require COVID to highlight, but one that is going to get worse as we go ahead and as we witness climatic changes happening across the world, demographics changing, preparedness for the next pandemic, as many of the sessions in the forum are also focused on. And so the point is that in addition to all the lessons learned, it's definitely something that we can't take our attention away from. That urgency, that sense of urgency, that sense of learning, that sense of, how do we not only take the learnings from COVID and how we responded, and many actors put heads together, but how do we better collaborate? How do we make sure that there is that strengthening of systems? Because very much similar to what my panelists have said here, around the food aspect, certainly on the health aspect, it's the fundamental requirement. And, I also understand that COVID, outside of COVID, medical oxygen was also just deemed as an essential medicine not very long ago. And so, what does that mean in terms of ensuring the structures and the systems that need to be put in place and to be strengthened as we go forward? And then in terms of the work that we're predominantly doing, across Kenya, Ethiopia, and Nigeria, we're taking a view of kind of a local lens to try and aim for building sustainable business models. So there is that commercial focus, but certainly looking at the social side of the solution. And how we work is, we've looked across the value chain, and there's been some conversation around the value chains in general. This business is hard. When entrepreneurs or businesses go into the oxygen manufacturing and supply chain, you have to think about a lot of things. You have to think about the equipment, bringing it in, distributing it, sales and manufacturing, how do you maintain spare parts availability, the technical knowledge, human resources. I mean, it's no wonder that entrepreneurs are, discouraged to go into this. And so as Oxygen Hub, we look at which parts of this value chain can we actually de-risk for the entrepreneurs, and can we actually build in those efficiencies and scale so that they can focus on sort of the locally led solution? We want them to be focused on the operations and the sales and distribution locally, while supporting them at sort of the higher level where we can build in economies of scale, whether that is through better negotiated contracts, for instance, with suppliers, looking around for partnerships when it comes to maintenance or spare parts, things like that. So taking sort of that Pan-African approach, but locally led, is one that, we believe will not only build for a long-term sustainable future, but it also helps decentralize that supply chain. Because the challenges that happened that were observed during COVID was, and there's a place and space for everyone, frankly. All the solutions from liquid, concentrators, donor, government-led PSAs, or private sector PSA-led models. There's a space and a value for all of them to play a role, because, and everything that I'm learning from conversations I'm having, I don't think anyone's ever said to me that there's a surplus of oxygen that they've found in any community. And so all to say is that the question we need to ask ourselves is, which solution is right for that context and for using a lens around a systems perspective, right? So the work we do, for instance, really looks at oxygen as something that is a right, a human right, especially essential. It's deemed as a medicine, so it needs to be, regardless of whether you can afford it, regardless of where you're located in the country, you shouldn't have to needlessly die from a lack of this. And so by unpacking that value chain and putting in place a process where we are actually supporting and de-risking and catalyzing some of this through entrepreneurs, where they can actually own this business and help them scale, that's something that's value add. It gives them actually voice at the decision making table, and really sets them up for a strengthening of a health system that we frankly believe is there for years to come, and will be better prepared than we were during COVID. And so that's a very exciting approach that for us we believe is one that we have, that we want to be able to scale and see it across Africa, but one that's decentralized. It's democratizing this supply chain that is extremely essential on the continent.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your thought around kind of how we can think about markets also as a solution on building resilience and sustainable sources of supply, like for oxygen, which is an essential need for the world. And I think we all maybe only realized that when the pandemic hit and there was a shortage of it everywhere. But and also thinking about how there's a way we can de-risk the value chain to be able to create opportunities for local actors to be involved. So thank you all for this first section, where we're really thinking through whether it's around the narratives and how they affect us, or how maximizing profits is not always useful for everybody or helpful for everybody, or how we're thinking through how markets are not always necessarily the solution, but similarly to what Shreenal said, they could also be a solution depending on how we really are thinking of organizing them. So shifting a little bit now around how we think about building resilience, how we think about shifting narratives and power, given this has been kind of most of what we've discussed so far. I'm curious, Amanda, I'm going to come to you on this one, but the pandemic has brought to light significant global supply chain challenges, and it has forced many businesses and organizations to address the limitations of the economic globalization and inequitable status quo. So I would really like to talk about how we will take to equitably localize value chains. So from your work, there are dominant narratives we've discussed in the past around local entrepreneurs that shape global economic systems, and they're deeply rooted in colonial legacies of extraction and exploitation. And who's winning and who's not winning when these systems are set up in that way, and how does localizing value chains can help remedy these injustices?
Yeah, so I spoke a bit earlier about all the positives of this trend towards localizing value chains and having these resilient local economic systems, right? We talked about circular, there's a circular economy can be benefited, can reduce our carbon footprint, can build community wealth, there's all these positive things. But there's a piece that I think we just can't ignore. We have to talk about it. And there is a real justice issue that comes up when we're talking about everyone relocalizing, right? We have the majority of people on the planet, the majority of the countries in the world have experienced colonialism and have experienced structural adjustment programs that have pushed them towards opening up their own markets, which has damaged, we've been hearing all about this, which has damaged local industries. And it's pushed them then to be able to afford those imports towards doing more for exports so they can get foreign exchange, right? I've had a very direct experience of this in the last year and a half because our organization is based out of Sri Lanka, and we have had a major foreign exchange crisis over the last year. I know a lot of countries are dealing with big challenges right now. So we have to talk about this. You can't just say, okay, now everyone's going to localize, when over the last many, many decades, everything's been set up to have raw materials and commodities that you have to export to get foreign exchange so you can buy the things that you're not producing locally anymore. We have to talk about this. And this is not an aid, charity, philanthropy discussion. This is a discussion about international trade rules. This is about systems change. This is something that we have to be talking about at that level. And I think a lot of, there's been kind of a race to the bottom. There are a lot of marginalized communities all over the world, including in Europe, including in the US, that have not benefited from this current system. And they've been pushed into kind of a race to the bottom to compete against each other for whatever little bit they can get. And this is the opportunity that we have to start talking about how we can collaborate, right? How can we work together across countries, across sectors, to work on changing those kinds of rules. So I'm going to give a couple suggestions on things we could be working on together, but there's a personal one that we can start with, right? This is a simple thing. And this comes back to what you said about decolonizing, right? How is it that we talk about English tea, Italian coffee, and Belgian and Swiss chocolate? There's no such thing. There's no such thing, right? There's no such thing. So there's big system level things we can do. But for us as individuals, one thing that we can do is decolonize how we're thinking about these things. Think about where your purchases are coming from. Buy locally. But when you do want to buy your coffee and your chocolate and things like that, whenever possible, buy from a brand, from a country that's actually producing it. There's Nigerian chocolate companies, right? There's groups in Ecuador doing chocolate. You can get Dilma tea. It's coming straight from Sri Lanka. The whole benefit goes back to that country that's producing it. And if you can't do that, there's all these amazing fair trade organizations out there that are making sure that the majority is still going back to the producer as we keep building up more fully producer-owned businesses, right? So that's a personal thing we can do. At a systems change level, we have to start talking about international trade laws. We have to talk about what the tariffs are for raw commodities versus what they are for processed products, right? We have to talk about, if we don't want to say the word debt forgiveness, we at least have to talk about debt recalculation, right? We have debt that came up through dictators. We have debt that we've paid off the principal so many times over, but we're still paying the interest. We have to talk about the impact of climate on our remaining debt payments, how that should be recalculated. And then the final thing is we have to start talking about democratizing the international organizations that are involved in our trade policies, right? So that there's actually a voice from the Global South and WTO and those kinds of things, that the decisions aren't being taken in separate rooms and people aren't having a say. So the point here is, if we really want to unleash the potential of resilient local economies, we cannot ignore the legacy that has left us with the economic system we have now. We have to start working to change it.
Thank you, Amanda. It makes me think about the debt that African countries still pay to their colonizers for their own freedom. And then we, on the other side, say we're giving money to Africa, but we're taking in barrels and then giving in little spoons. So there's definitely a lot of rethinking that has to be done there. Thank you so much. Ndidi, coming to you. In your recent article in SSIR, you state, when funders are challenged about their poor track record of supporting local African organizations, their principal arguments are that they cannot find credible and capable local companies, or that they prefer to work with trusted partners who are already in their system. So what inaccuracies in the dominant narrative that you talked about earlier about African entrepreneurs, specifically around credibility and capability, need to change in order for us to move to a more equitable space?
Thanks so much for that question, and Amanda for president. So this is near and dear to my heart. You know, the Bridgespan Group released some data a few years ago that said only 5.6% of the funds that were supposed to be allocated to Africa actually went to local organizations. In terms of, I think it was out of $9 billion, 5.6% went to local organizations. In the area of health, malaria in particular, only 1% went to local research organizations. And even when you look at the whole spectrum of giving, I think only 14% of funds from African philanthropists go to local organizations. So there is a challenge here, which has to be disrupted. From a perspective that, number one, they can't find the local organizations, the truth is that in every economy, there are local organizations doing things. Whether you they're registered, whether they have annual reports, whether they are recognized on GuideStar, whether they've gotten a Skoll award. There's a full spectrum, right, of what it takes to find those local organizations. But they exist, and they're doing work at the lowest levels, and they are delivering impact. But that impact is not being measured or recognized. So the first challenge for us is to first understand that in every economy when we come into there, we have to do a mapping to find who is doing what. And we have to work with them because they can do the work at a fraction of the cost than we can. And so for every board I sit on, I've challenged every organization to commit to tracking how much actually goes to local organizations. And when you start tracking, you find out it's very little. So my first request is if you sit on a board, ask the board to start tracking, and you want to see the data. How much is going to local organizations? And when I define local, proximate, who is on the leadership team? They have to be local. Who is on the management team? They have to be local. Don't tell me that you're sitting in San Francisco and doing work in Bauchi State in Nigeria. And when funders tell me that, oh, we're funding in Nigeria, who are you funding? And if I see that the accountant sits in London, then you know you're not working in Bauchi. Because there's no way, as Nigerians, we know that your CFO has to be sitting in the country. Because you can deliver good work if you're monitoring everything that happens. So number one, let's find them. And through the African Philanthropy Forum, we've actually started Start Points, which has a list of organizations that have been vetted. And we're partnering with others to increase that list. So if you're looking for local organizations, please go to all the resources, including the Africa Philanthropy Forum. The second is we need to change our mindset around the capacity and the reporting requirements of these organizations. Because no organization, no international NGO was built overnight. Many of the organizations we celebrate have taken years to get to where they're going. And we have to handhold and support organizations. So I always challenge funders, if you must work with an international NGO, insist that they mentor local organizations along the way and eventually work themselves out of a job. That's what success looks like in development. And let's channel resources towards advocacy and communication, because these organizations need to increase their profiles and their visibility, and they need to be celebrated on the global stage. And that's one of the reasons I created Africa Food Changemakers, because I recognize that millions of people just like me doing work on the African continent, but you don't know about them. How do we increase their visibility so that we are not one Atti or one Ndidi sitting on this platform, but there are thousands and there are millions? And so democratizing that information is critical. And then finally, where you can, have local advisory boards, right? Have local organizations, local law firms that can vet, local due diligence organizations, they exist because it's all part of the local value chain. Where we see, and I will take on big funders, where we see large DFIs starting multi-million-dollar project, and 5 years later there's no evidence that it existed, it's because they brought in everything and they took everything with them. And that's not building local value chains, and that's not sustainability. And I think the people in this room have the power to make a difference. And we can start today. Thank you.
I think I would add there, when the pandemic hit, I was living in Addis, and we all experienced the COVID flight where everybody who was not Ethiopian left. And if they worked for an international organization, they left with the money. And then who was left to do the work were the local organizations with a fraction of the budget. But this is their home. They're not going anywhere, and they're going to struggle through the challenges and stay. But then now that we think we're in a post-pandemic world, they're all back with the money, and nothing has changed. It kind of feels like the world has a very short attention span when it comes to things like this, and we've all kind of forgotten kind of where we were. So I really appreciate what you were saying, and I want to take this opportunity to just say thank you to the people who do the unglamorous work on the ground, on their communities, and are not really here to look for somebody to tell them they're doing a great job or for any of those things, but because they really truly believe in the communities that they work for. So thank you for bringing that up, Ndidi. So shifting a little bit around shifting power, I would like to explore solutions. We know we're all a solution-oriented community, and we want to address problems and think through like how can we solve these from a personal, structural, or organizational levels. So I want to talk a little bit more about exploring solutions towards sustainability and resilience. Where there's value, we all know there's power. So shifting power requires creating shared value chains and disruption networks where local value creators and their communities can benefit in ways that have not been able to in the past, like all of us have talked about in the past. So coming to you, Marcio, your work is centered around enabling diverse bioeconomies that support sustainable livelihoods for local communities. Can you share an example with us of an indigenous knowledge-based market system that goes against the status quo and has advantages, and like what the advantages are of that approach?
Sure, thank you, Atti. I think I will talk about Amazon chocolate, not Swiss, Austrian, or we are working the experience in this territory. I was sharing with you some stories before. We are working with Brazil nuts, açaí, artisan products, and cacao. These are the 4 priority value chains we are supporting the local indigenous organizations to develop, to structure. There are huge challenges and very interesting stories about each one of them. I could talk as an example about the artisan products produced by the women artisans in these communities, and how important it was to strengthen these women's organizations in these territories, and how that brought about lots of changes in the balance of decision-making process between men and women, the involvement in the engagement of the youth. And this is something that, when we think about market, it's very much linked to the increasing of the tourism, the ethno and ecotourism in the region, and all this potential of this special value chain, let's say, the tourism represents when you think about communities and Amazon. About Brazil nuts, it's interesting to mention this specific value chain because it has a behavior, let's say, it's a kind of a commodity product, Brazil nuts. And we struggled a lot to build a processing plant managed by indigenous organizations and indigenous cooperative, the first processing unit for Brazil nuts in that region. It's really hard, and it brings this perspective about the necessity of funding for that. These indigenous organizations, they really need funding opportunities to structure these facilities, like processing facilities. Otherwise, they will keep selling their products, as the Brazil nuts is, to middlemen who are buying these Brazil nuts and just crossing the border to Bolivia, where the cities, so I visited 2 cities in the border between Bolivia and Brazil. There are 25 processing units, one of the cities. All the economy of that city moves around the Brazil nuts value chain. And to avoid that, it's really necessary to have this investment. And when Ndidi talked about the percentage of funds going to the organizations, we see how important the indigenous territories are for the climate balance, for the climate context to mitigate climate change. And so the forest is standing in indigenous territories in the Amazon. And these people need to be recognized about that, to have this flow of climate funds, which is even lower, less than that. It's about less than 1% of all the climate funds around the world flows to indigenous territories, to local communities and indigenous people organizations. So it could make a big change if we can really make sure these flows happen. And a very interesting experience, a very interesting story to share is about chocolate, is about cacao, because this perspective of climate resilience involves a lot about restoration strategies. There are lots of, so millions and millions of hectares to be restored, to be reforested. Around the world and also in the Amazon, degraded areas to be reforested, and we found out some opportunities to plant 1 million trees in the last 3 years, and it was really interesting because this, the momentum to design these agroforestry systems it was just at the beginning of the pandemic. And at that moment, these indigenous people were facing the challenge of the lack of food security. You know, they because of their production system being so much focused on the market, they left behind their traditional, not in every case, but there were many cases of territories where we work where they really faced this challenge of having food during the pandemic and depending on donations of food. And then at that moment we start to design these agroforestry systems, and they decided to plant lots of fruits. Of course, having cacao as an example as the main plant there, you know, to allow then the production they need, the economic perspectives they want to explore. But they also gave value to the food security aspect, planting a great diversity of fruits in these agroforestry systems. And planting cacao as a short-term culture, let's say after 4 years you can already harvest cacao. Different of Brazil nuts, you need to wait for 30, 40 years. But it was really interesting to establish, and this is important, to emphasize the necessity of giving value to the local commercial arrangements to be explored. And an Amazon company of very gourmet chocolate called De Mendes. We got to bring this chocolatier to visit, to know, to be around in these indigenous communities. And this guy is totally committed to teach, to share his knowledge about how to produce very good quality cacao along the fermentation and the drying process inside the villages. And this man, this chocolatier, is buying all the cacao from these people, you know, totally committed to buy more and more, you know, and he developed a very rich chocolate bar, 70% of cacao from these indigenous people, paying 3 times what they used to be paid selling to the big traders. So this man is, this commitment to structure the value chains, giving value to the local knowledge, to the origin of this product, made a big difference for these communities. I think this is an experience interesting to be shared.
That's really fascinating how you can create more value. I think Ndidi talked about this earlier as well, and Shreenal, by bringing in maybe like going vertical on the production of whatever the commodity or the item is in the local area that you're at, so that you're not really just shipping it to somewhere else just across the border, so that value is added to that particular commodity. Thank you for that, Marcio. Shreenal, coming to you. I'm really curious to know how you're building more resilient communities by localizing medical oxygen supply chains. And I really would love to talk about localizing value chains to increase resilience, which you touched upon a little bit earlier. And what are the solutions that you're implementing at Oxygen Hub and kind of in your industry that you're seeing to increase resilience in the value chains, and what role can philanthropy play in making local businesses self-reliant and prepared for the next global crisis, or like the next pandemic? We all know it's going to come at some point.
Sure. Thank you for that. I think, as I mentioned before, you know, when we look at sort of resilience, we unpack it into 2 ways, which is, you know, we have to consider the equity component of it, and we have to look at it from a systems angle. And so this touches on an entire ecosystem. Everyone is involved from beginning to end in terms of the role they play across this system. We're a small part of this solution across the value chain. And so when we start positioning ourselves as I mentioned earlier, thinking global, locally led, Pan-African solutions, there are things that we can help in sort of unpacking, and I'll speak a little bit about that. But there are also considerations where there are things outside of our control that we truly do need help on. And so if I split it up into two things, the first part is on supply chain, and I'll give some examples here. We work in Kenya. We have franchisee partnerships there. We help set up the medical oxygen plants. One of the challenges that we faced pretty early on was this notion from the Standards Bureau that the purity levels that needed to be produced had to be 99% or higher. And that's just not the standard. The standard that the WHO encourages is plus or minus 93%. And so the advocacy and the effort required to educate, to push, and to challenge some of these notions that directly affected those communities that we were trying to activate was something that took time. We needed help there. Similarly, you've got issues in Ethiopia, for instance, where we've got plants there and access to things like spare parts, which are not available and we need to import them. But then when you're talking about high import duties and taxes, I mean, in some markets, you're paying the same tax on a medical cylinder for oxygen that you are for industrial gases. There's no distinction. And the usage of this across the value chain is completely different. Who picks up those battles? You've got challenges when it comes to trade agreements. Amanda, you were talking about that. I wish there were suppliers of the plants that we provide locally built in Africa, because what we're facing right now, and this is of course acknowledging all the well-intentioned work that's coming from global donors, but there was an influx of PSA plants, of cylinders, of all of that 2.5 years ago. Those warranties will run out very soon. And we're going to end up having a very tragic situation, and it is happening a little bit, where you're going to have a truckload of equipment just sitting there not being looked after because there hasn't been a long-term view of how do we solve for the maintenance, for access to spare parts, how do we build a workforce and the knowledge around the different types of engineering capabilities that needs to be in place on the continent, given the context in which these plants are operating in. So elevation has a direct impact in the amount of oxygen that we can produce through a PSA plant that is being manufactured from a different country across the world. And that's a reality. That is the challenge that we're having to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And that's just one part. That starts having a ripple effect across the value chain when you have a hospital, for instance, that is looking for this medical oxygen to supply to its patients, and then you have a breakdown. So there are a lot of fundamental challenges that, frankly, we look for thought partners and leaders to help solve for. Simple things like credit risk. This is the reason why we de-risk some of this challenges for the entrepreneurs. But considering that you've got other players in the market who are not fully incentivized to be able to supply for medical oxygen, and so here taking into account challenges on procurement, payment terms. I mean, Kenya, we were having a conversation earlier today, someone acknowledged it's a 180-day payment term. We don't get money back after 180 days. And so naturally, those components, those are realities, but those are also some of the things that funders need to be considerate of. If you flip the coin and look at it from a demand angle, I mean, we're no longer in a quote-unquote COVID scenario, but there is still a gap between acknowledging that there is definitely a need for medical oxygen, but how does that translate into the demand? Because if we start now building up the PSA plans and the supply chain, we have to consider the demand angle. And so there's a lot of work, certainly, that's being done in the form of, market assessments, that perhaps there's an opportunity to contextualize a little bit more. Secondly, clinical trainings, for instance, CHAI, the Paths of the World, they're doing a lot of work in this, and we're going into it as well, for instance, in Nigeria, to really understand, well, what happens when that oxygen gets to the hospital? What is the level of skill set and the training that's required to administer it, to monitor it, when medical oxygen is considered as an essential medicine, how is it actually, noticed at that point in the patient that suffers from hypoxia, for instance? And what does that mean in terms of increased consumption, so that hospitals don't have to hoard this oxygen or make difficult decisions between procuring medical oxygen versus, syringes or something like that, right? So those are some of the issues that we face, but that we're trying to unpack. And of course, the collaboration that is, all the work that's being done in different facets is welcome, and we're encouraged to see, but it's just not enough. We just have to have so much more of a one voice, one coordinated approach, and really transparency, frankly, around a lot of these decisions that are being made, like you mentioned, Ndidi, if you're sitting somewhere else outside of the continent making these decisions, involve the guys that are actually doing the work so that you're better informed. There's a bit of a long-term approach to some of these solutions that are well-intentioned, and that we don't end up having to circle back and face same challenges, except, we talked about them 3-4 years ago. And so finally, to your point around what does this mean from funders and donors' perspective, I think this is exactly the best use of donor money, is to catalyze some of these challenges that are faced by entrepreneurs in the form of ecosystem building, in the form of de-risking some of these investments, with the view of sustainability, not with the view of just give it for free in perpetuity. We want to make this self-reliant, but these challenges are big and they're not going to get solved overnight. But it starts from the sort of, grassroots up. This is the solutions that are being built. This is what's needed in the communities. This is how it's working. How can donors be more involved in advocacy and trying to think through, some of the FX challenges that you mentioned as well, Atti. How can they involve themselves so that there's relevance in sort of the work that they're doing with the entrepreneurs, but it's truly catalytic.
Thank you so much, Shreenal. There's conversations around trade laws, taxation systems, credit de-risking, and just really supporting the role philanthropy can play in kind of catalyzing the early stage development of organizations or companies like Oxygen Hub that are working, and your partners that are working to prepare us for the next challenge that we will face in the future. And we all know that maybe if we were prepared earlier, we would have saved more lives during the COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you to our panelists. I think we're going to open it up. We have a little bit of time to open it up for questions from the audience. If you would like, I think over there. Gentleman over here. There. And over here as well. Next.
Thank you, panelists. A great set of presentations. I was wondering, so I work with Marcio and Forest Trans on these issues, and it's been a long journey to think about supply chains and what one could do to really systemically change it. I think that was the point you made, Amanda. And I'm a forester, so when we think about Brazil nuts, I think about the forests that the Brazil nuts grow in. And as Marcio was saying, the incredible climate benefit that brings to society that we are not recognizing in that product. So when we think about going down the commodity path, we might be missing a whole bunch of opportunities to bring the global values that those products bring to us that really should be embedded in that price, right? It should be that chocolate that comes out of that area is benefiting us all. So we should be paying 10 times more for that because we're not recognizing those benefits. And so I'm wondering, even in this world of commodities, if a systemic change would be to say, let's not just think about the product, let's think about the function that crop is providing to us as a society. That might be one thing to think about.
Thank you. Yeah, a few more questions and then we can answer them.
Sorry, Atti, I have a question about when you look at the whole world. I believe, Ndidi, very much as you're sort of saying that we have to change our cultural mindset. And I grew up with that same. From Ireland, we would have had the same of the hungry in Africa, and it was always that focus. But one of the things we're looking at is on the impact capital side, on debt. And you're talking about everything is focused on exporting. What's your views? Because we see nearly 90% of the debt is dollar-based, and obviously, if you're funding people into dollars and you're providing them capital in dollars, it's really hard to expect a company then to sell locally and to do that. So I'm wondering of your thoughts around that and how to change it, if it needs changing, if you think, and then how to change it.
Thank you. There's another. Oh, here as well. Yeah.
Sorry, I've got, I suppose, just a few comments, and thank you so much. Really, really interesting. I was in a great panel, a great meeting this morning with this panel, and what you were saying, Shreenal, about really resonated around actually the donor's job. At the moment, a lot of it is around fixing the problem, but not necessarily solving the problem. So they use the example around vaccinations. Yeah, all the vaccinations are coming in, and they've basically cured polio with a vaccine, for example, but it's not being manufactured within the country. So I think there was a big thing about, from the donor's point of view, you actually need to think about how you're going to solve the problem. And the other piece, which I thought was really interesting, is also whose strategy you're using. Is it your strategy as a funder, or is it what's needed in the country? So that's just an observation. Thank you. And then the other piece I just want to pick up, which is completely separate, but I was, Amanda, you mentioned actually TEF. And so I was thinking sort of against this, in terms of value chains, sure, you've got your cash crops, but you've also got your staples. And I might be wrong, Atti, but I seem to remember with TEF, it suddenly became a superfood. Suddenly it became exported, and it had a huge value. And then suddenly the local market couldn't afford, which is a staple food, they couldn't afford to buy it. So there's also that piece around trying to keep, I suppose, where is it harmful as well as positive. So.
Thank you. I think there was one more hand, if I saw correctly. If not, we can answer. Yeah, over there. Yeah, while we're doing that, there's a question over there. We can get the mic. The question around TEF, as an Ethiopian, I think I can take out that question until we get. She's already. I'll get to that in a minute. Please.
Hi, I have a bit of a more theoretical question in the use of the language localizing, because coming from the Italian market, localizing has also very political affiliation, and a lot of the local market wouldn't be a fairer market, if you say what I say. So I wonder if we could try, if as a movement we should use a different type of language, which is not only about localizing, but is about empowering and changing and shifting the model. And I don't know how, and as soon as you use shifting model, a lot of the companies and the stop listening. So I don't know, the question is more, is there a better word than localizing? Because in some of the agricultural markets in Italy, localizing wouldn't be solving the problem. The exploitation will continue, just from different type of exploiters, not maybe from Tesco, but from other. So I'm just, okay.
Thank you. So we have questions around the definition of localizing, also around debt, and how do we think through if debt is coming in dollars, but then those who have to pay back their debts would have to produce foreign currency. What does that look like? The comment around solving versus fixing the problem. So I want to just see who from the panel wants to take a stab at any of those.
Maybe I can, a couple questions together, especially the ones that came around products, prices of TEF, right, around localizing. I think one of the things that's exciting to see is that these are emerging ecosystems in an area, right? And so you might have some producers that really put a lot of effort into telling their story about, we talked about it being embedded, it's regenerative and distributed by design. So there's some that might put a lot of effort into telling this is how we do that, here's the bigger value when you purchase our product, and those might have a higher price, right? And I think it's both and, right? It's an ecosystem. There's different strategies, and we're testing them all out. And at the same time, when that happens, we get people saying, oh, these products that are conscious products, they're too expensive, marginalized communities can't afford them, they get priced out of the market. But what we're seeing, if you're actually like looking at the local level, is maybe the first one that comes up is the high value product, and they're trying to find a high value market for it. And then we have groups that their innovation is, well, we actually want to do that for our local consumers. So we've seen this in Sri Lanka, where we've now got a really, really strong ecosystem. The next wave was, well, we want to make sure that local people can have organic food. So our enterprise is going to focus on how do we supply affordable, nutritious, organic food to the local market. So I think if we think it's not either or, right? We're seeing all of these different strategies coming up, and it's all of it together that's creating the ecosystem. And it's the same thing, I think, for the localization story. It's a both and. So we have groups that are working, like in the States, there's groups trying to work on procurement. And I think the key word that we're looking for isn't localization. We're looking for enterprises that put people and planet first. That's the number one thing, right? If they also happen to be local, plus, right? That's fantastic. If they're owned by a marginalized group, extra points in your procurement process. So with a lot of these things, we just have to be careful that we're not taking this either or perspective. We're looking at how can we enable all of this and kind of give extra recognition where it's due.
And just to build on, I completely agree with Amanda, and just two things. One, on the debt issue, I definitely think we have to think about more catalytic funding models that are focused on local organizations and don't put them out of business. So whenever any funder comes to me, especially debt or equity, I'm like, is it dollar denominated? If it's dollar denominated, you're really going to put the company out of business, especially in a country where devaluation has been 50% or 60% in the last 2 years. In food and ag, we're looking for catalytic patient capital that's denominated in local currency, or if it has to be pegged to an international currency, then let somebody else come in and provide that debt guarantee or pricing guarantee to keep them solid, because it's a tough ecosystem, right? If you're driven by impact, you want patient capital.
Yeah.
Impact driven, looking at multiple layers and levers, not just IRRs and double-digit returns. And so that's what we're expecting and appealing for in our context. And we're starting to see a few very visionary funders coming into the ecosystem. And just my closing remarks, I think for me, when we think about localization, I still would like to use that word in my context, because we've had so much of the opposite, where the food company we own is viewed as proudly Nigerian is bad, proudly Nigerian is substandard. That mindset has shifted over 12 years of working on ACE Foods, where people now realize local is good. It's sourced from farmers. It's healthier. It's natural. It has a shorter value chain. You know what I mean? That shift has to take place, where people are proud of what's sourced locally, and they embrace their food for being the best food that it could possibly be, because so much damage has been done already. And when we get to the level of Italy, where Italian food is now, number 2 in the world, then we can talk about shifting that narrative.
I'd like to just add a couple of thoughts on this. Fully agree with the narratives that Amanda and Ndidi are putting in. For us, and agree, localization is so important because, for instance, our first 3 entrepreneurs are women-led, and they come with experience in other aspects of the community. So we have a woman entrepreneur that actually is a nurse by training and has a bunch of clinics. We have entrepreneurs that are an MFI, so in finance with absolutely no health background. We've got others that sort of have diversified their business from blood transportation and donations to oxygen. The point is that it sort of sets a narrative that you can diversify your business as you're locally led, you're locally bred, you understand the community that you're serving, you build equity within your community because you understand that issue. Often, and unfortunately often, and we're still seeing this, when you look at foreign entities, whether they're locally based, manufacturing, oxygen in our case, you will come across things like price distortion, you will come across things like service issues, half the cylinders received are filled, and so that's created kind of a bitter taste for a lot of the hospitals that we talk to. Furthermore, you've got distortion activities that come in, as I talked about earlier, and that's just creating, just a dynamic that isn't friendly from a market dynamics perspective. And that I go into my fourth point, which is around the financing and sort of the debt instruments. Our view is that you can approach this social lens with a commercial lens by educating these entrepreneurs that you need to think about self-reliance. The donor funding or any sort of funding is there to get you going. But, and I think one of you guys mentioned, the vision would be if you can run this on your own and scale and serve your community, our job's done. That's great. That's what we want to see. And so whilst there are all these challenges, and we welcome conversations around how do you think about, especially in our case when we're having to import everything, and there's devaluing currencies in pretty much all the markets we work in at the moment. How do we think about this? How do we bake that in so that we're not only price competitive, because that's what the market is asking for, but that we're serving this community in the right way, and that this funding is actually being used in a manner that is going to get 5 years, 10 years out of the lifeline of these plants and of the business and allows them to scale. These are real challenges that entrepreneurs are trying to figure out, because it's a black or a white solution that they've heard so far. Yeah. And I think there's an opportunity to create something that is nuanced enough, that caters to things that are currently destabilizing, but really gives an opportunity for entrepreneurs to look beyond the current challenges in the mode of like funding, for instance.
Thank you so much. I know we're almost at time, but Marcio, if you have any closing thoughts.
I'm thinking about very, very powerful in the perspective of a region as the Amazon is, where many times the lack of law, of rules is really serious when illegal activities have so much power, like illegal logging, illegal mining, and all these issues related to the lack of tenure definitions, their land ownership. The importance of and the power of some public policies, of some state-based initiatives. And in the case of Brazil, when a former government, Lula, who's back now, what he did, that government, it was created a policy to allow farmers to deliver their products directly to the what's so-called institutional markets, like the food school system. Open an opportunity, like 30% all of the food to be purchased by the government should be from local farmers. And it's amazing how important it was, and it was totally weakened and destroyed in the last years of Bolsonaro administration. Now in the first 3 months of Lula government, the investment on this strategy increased like 40%, only in 3 months, in the 3 first months. So it's important to emphasize the necessity of laws and public policies to make sure the local arrangements are promoted to empower the basis of the value chains, and many times localizing is the strategy, is the best strategy, but not always, but many times.
Thank you. that as I'm closing out, when I think of the localization question, I think definitely I understand that it can be political and challenging, and in today's time, it can also err on xenophobia a little bit. So there's a lot of work to be done around like what do we mean by local, and how do we not create, as we're thinking of globalization and the impacts it's had in the world that has not necessarily been just, what does it mean when we think about localization, and how do we use this opportunity to help create a system that's not kind of replicating the same issues and injustices that we've seen in the past. And I think when I think of the rules and government and the role government can play, and it comes down to the question of TEF actually, is one difference we've seen between TEF and quinoa is the Ethiopian government actually put a cap on how much TEF could be exported to be able to ensure that Ethiopians can afford to eat their staple food. But that is against the whole idea of free market economies and just kind of export everything for the value of $1, and our currency continues to devaluate. So we are paying a price for it, but there are solutions, and they're not always necessarily, there's a price to pay for those solutions sometimes. So thank you again for everyone, and first and foremost, I really want to thank our panelists for this insightful discussion. To tie this up, I want to add that humanity has a precious few opportunities to learn from the mistakes of colonization and globalization. And all of us here have the opportunity to assess where we stand in the social impact value chain, and as creators, as consumers, and as enablers to ensure that we make local communities resilient in our work and in our daily lives. And again, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your sessions.